Let's talk Radeon and virtual reality, a sore spot for the Adrenalin drivers and the Radeon series, and it has been for a while now. Every time a new Adrenalin driver drops, I go and I check it out in Steam VR. There's been a latency issue with Adrenalin for a while now, and I think it was best documented by this person here. They describe a motion to photon latency issue, essentially meaning when you turn your head, it's slow to react in the headset. They tested a lot of hardware and also showcase a whole bunch of other people who have experienced this issue. I too noticed this issue back when I did some 7900 XTX testing on the 13700K and the 7800 X3D. This was my attempt to show what that lag looks like, but honestly, it's not a great example. It's a difficult thing to showcase. But this thread in the AMD forums about photon latency got the attention of the Radeon developers, and they were working on a solution, and that was delivered in the latest version of the drivers, 2024 12.1. Unfortunately, there isn't an explicit call out within the release notes, at least none that I could see here. And that's always a little frustrating. I know there's a lot of tinkering that happens underneath the hood, but it would be nice to see it. I was excited to try out this update, but instantly disappointed. Right here in the desktop, we're looking at just nothing running, just Steam VR, and we're seeing magenta frame spikes clearly shown in the Steam VR window. These represent display errors, and they are constantly happening. I switched the headset to 80 Hz and I was greeted with the same error. This time I have FPS VR also running. I did test this in the simulator and it was terrible, but I don't have footage of it. What's interesting though is when I switch it to 120 Hz and the display errors completely disappear. Well, I mean, there's a couple here just because of how I'm handling the headset, but it's solved, it's fixed, it runs great. So what the heck is going on? One user suggested that enabling motion smoothing removes these display errors. I didn't test that because it's an undesirable feature when enabled in racing simulators or flight simulators because we're always moving forward while the interpolation calculation that is deployed is using the previous frames to anticipate the upcoming frames. But there are parts of the environment that we haven't seen yet. So how can that feature help us? Well, it doesn't, and it can create some side effects, which I've shown in previous videos. Another option is to disable the asynchronous projection that is on by default with Steam VR, but if you do that, any missed frame results in a very obvious stutter, so that's worse. So we don't want to disable that either. While this appears to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I am encouraged that the Radeon team is willing to make fundamental changes with how their drivers work in VR. I'll move on to the benchmark data I have in a second, but I want to take a moment to encourage anybody who wants to see AMD resolve these issues, who is a user of Steam VR or any other VR technology, and you see this photon to latency issue and this 2024 12.1 update here in the Adrenalin drivers, it hasn't fixed that for you or it has caused another problem. I need you guys to go to the forums, find the threads, I'll have them in the comments below, and make a post. Up some votes. Make sure that the dev team can see this so that this doesn't get pushed off another few months, that we see the update in the next driver release. It's on all of us to do our work and be some squeaky wheels. Today's testing is on the B650 platform for AM5, allowing me to use my 9800 X3D. PBO is enabled, and I have the Expo memory timings also selected, which is applied to the G-Skill memory, 32 gigabytes, DDR5, 6000, CL30. I'll be testing 3 graphics cards across 3 different scenarios within iRacing. My 7900 XTX with 24 gigabytes is from XFX. The 3080 Ti, now featuring just 2 cooling fans, is from EVGA. This is equivalent to a 4070 series card, maybe leaning more towards a Ti or a Ti Super, while the 4080 Super is from Gigabyte. I used 2 replays from week 13 for iRacing. This includes prototypes around Daytona, prototypes around Spa, and then my IMSA replay around Zandvoort. The race at Daytona was a bit of a disaster. All of the races at Daytona were a disaster in week 13. But for the nature of this testing, it's fine, even if I hit a banana peel. The scenario I want to start with first, though, is at Spa. As usual, I'll send the replay footage up to the top of the screen and I'll reveal the frame time chart. If you're new here and you haven't seen my introduction to VR benchmarking, check out this video and get yourself up to speed. This testing was performed at 120 hertz, which means I had to decrease my image resolution as per what you see there, which I believe is 160 SS. And we want the distribution of frame times to be to the left of the 120 hertz lines, designated in that dashed yellow color. The 4080 Super is the gold line, the 3080 Ti is silver, and the 7900 XTX is red. I also had to adjust my iRacing graphics as shown here, although I did end up going with draw all cars, and I do not recommend these LOD settings. There's quite a bit of pop-up. I tested with 2 times MSAA, and I only used 1 mirror. Keep in mind, we're trying to achieve 120 hertz here. I selected these settings to push to the limits of the 7900 XTX, maybe a little past, and then I wanted to compare that to the 3080 Ti, which represents a 4070 series card, and the 4080 Super to see how those two handle that limit. The 4080 Super did rather well in this test with most of its data points under 8 milliseconds, while the 7900 XTX just trailed past our 120 hertz line at 8.3 milliseconds. Meanwhile, the 3080 Ti, it struggled a little bit, and we can see a significant number of its frame times slip past that dashed yellow line. Those of you with keen eyes may have noticed that there is an off word behind both of the NVIDIA cards, and that's because I have SPS disabled. This is a GeForce specific technology, and it requires a simulator to adopt it. As far as I know, iRacing is the only one. And I first wanted to show the natural performance of these cards without that SPS difference. So when I turn on SPS with the 4080 Super, here's what happens. The frame times shown in green from the 4080 Super with SPS on shift to the left. Not by a lot, but by a measurable margin. So is this GeForce feature enough to save the 3080 Ti's performance? The blue line shows SPS enabled, but it is not enough to get all of that frame time performance to the left of our dashed line. We would have to reduce the resolution further or decrease some other graphic options. When a graphics card is late delivering its frames, it's going to force the CPU to be late. So let's look at the CPU frame time chart now. With the 4080 Super able to deliver all of its frames on time, even with SPS off, the 9800X3D is represented here with its best performance. And when we compare it to the 3080 Ti, we see that impact of the graphics card struggling. It just drags out the processor's performance. When I enable SPS on the 4080 Super, look at this change in the CPU frame times. This is a much bigger shift than what we saw in the graphics card frame times, and that might be confusing on the surface. Isn't SPS a NVIDIA feature? Like, why is it changing the CPU's performance? Keep in mind that virtual reality requires a stereoscopic image, as in a slightly different scene presented in the left and the right eye. That's what tricks our brain into thinking we're looking at a 3D image. The render instruction is sent from the CPU. So if we have two different images, that's two different sets of instructions. SPS stands for single pass stereo, and it allows the GeForce to draw all of that geometry only once and then extrapolate from that the two images it needs for the left and the right eye. Most other VR titles don't have a really busy and difficult compute on the CPU. So there's plenty of headroom to do that stereoscopic rendering twice. It's fine. Unlike iRacing, which is very demanding on the processor. So if we can reduce its responsibilities to draw two scenes, that's going to present us with much better frame times. When I enable it on the 3080 Ti, shown here in blue, we can see that it closely mimics the 4080 Super's performance. The CPU is performing as we expect. The only reason why it's slipping past that line is because the 3080 Ti is overwhelmed. The actual GPU, the VRAM, that architecture just can't handle the same rendering workload as the 40 series. So let's flip back to the GPU frame time chart, and now I'll bring in a bar chart showing this data. In gray, we have the average FPS, and the green percentage is the GPU on-time delivery. For example, the 3080 Ti is at 84%. That is to say, 84% of its frame times are to the left of that 120 hertz danger line, and 16% is late. So in this scenario, the 7900 XTX can outperform a 3080 Ti, and I suggest can outperform a 4070 series card, even though GeForce has SPS. So now let's change the scenario and go to Zandvoort, this IMSA replay that I've been using for over a year, I think, and it's a great one. We've got a whole bunch of prototypes out in front, but this perspective is in the mid-pack GT4. And without SPS enabled, we see the 3080 Ti really struggle here to try and achieve 120 frames per second. The 4080 Super in yellow is still able to outshine the XTX. And when we turn on SPS, we see the advantage increase for the 4080 Super. It has great results here. Previously, I've shown the 3080 Ti to be able to do pretty good around Zandvoort, but when we go to 120 hertz, it's not possible. Even with SPS, these settings are too high. This resolution is too high. It's pretty amazing we see SPS bring us from 23% on time to 83% on time. So it's definitely an impressive feature, but in this case, not enough. Switching over to the frame time chart of the CPU, we see the impact of the graphics cards. With SPS disabled, like it would be in all the other simulators, we see that the 4080 Super is just able to let that 9800 X3D finish its frame times on time, while the 7900 XTX in red lags behind a little bit and develops a significant tail that drifts past that 120 hertz line. But when we look at the gray line for the 3080 Ti, yikes, that's not good. The 9800 X3D is capable of much faster performance, but that graphics card is holding it up. Enabling SPS dramatically improves the performance of the 9800 X3D with the 4080 Super. iRacing is very demanding when we're running so many different car models. Being able to render that geometry in one pass is a big advantage. Now looking at the blue line representing the 3080 Ti with SPS, and we can see the shift here in the CPU frame time. Whereas the green line resolves by 6 milliseconds, the blue line for the 3080 keeps on going. Even though it's on time, all of those frames are caused by a GPU that can't handle the rendering. My last scenario is at Daytona, a notoriously CPU-intense track. When we look at the frame times, we see a double hump because the frame times that are quick, so under, let's say, 6 milliseconds, that's when you're not looking at the infield, when you're out on the outer banking and there's not much rendering happening. Once you turn back in towards the infield, that's when we get those FPS dips, and it creates that second hunch in the frame times. But with only one mirror enabled and an only prototype field, Daytona is actually much easier to render here, despite the car park that's happening around us with all these crashed cars. Enabling SPS with the 4080 Super does shift the frame times to the left, or actually kind of tightens them up more so, because we're still around that 4.5 milliseconds for the lowest frame time. And when we do the same for the 3080 Ti, we're able to get perfect performance. All the frames are beneath that 120 hertz line. If we were running WEC and we had all those hypercars and GT3s and LMP2s, I think performance would be very different here. And that's the struggle with iRacing, that you can't just go from Mazda to IMSA and expect there to be the same performance. I know it frustrates all of you, but you have to recognize the step up in simulation that we're experiencing. Looking now at the CPU frame times, and it's a little strange. The 4080 Super and 3080 Ti look very similar up until about 5.5 milliseconds. That's when the 3080 Ti's frame times start to trail out towards the 120 hertz line and past it, while the yellow 4080 Super is able to resolve them all on time. It's surprising to see the 7900 XTX have so many data points to the right of the 120 hertz line compared to the 3080 Ti without SMP. Perhaps the Radeon cannot flex its VRAM advantage when there's only, 5 or 6 car models. Enabling SMP on both GeForce cards and their CPU frame time charts look almost identical. And that makes the 7900 XTX's performance a little disappointing here. So I'd like to circle back and conclude this video with a tuning session. We're back at the IMSA cars around Zandvoort with the 7900 XTX. I disabled the default asynchronous projection through FPS VR, allowing me to use 90 Hz in SteamVR without those display errors, that repeating magenta line that we saw in the frame time chart. Performance was great on the 7900 XTX. I did not notice that latency with the headset that I saw in previous driver versions. As long as all frames are delivered on time, the performance in the headset should be smooth. Once we drop a frame, it's going to appear as a very clear stutter in the headset. And I wanted to push to that stuttering. I just wanted to see what it looked like. The quickest way to increase or decrease GPU load is by increasing or decreasing the render resolution. So with the yellow line, I bumped up SteamVR resolution to 180%, which in this case is 2704 by 3004. All the frames were delivered on time, so I thought, all right, let's bump it up this time with MSAA from 2 times to 4 times. And we can see the shift in the GPU frame times, and we're getting really close to that 90 hertz requirement of 11.1 milliseconds. If I were tuning for smooth VR experience, I would stop here, but I want to push and make some dropped frames. Pushing the resolution even higher to 220%, I was able to do that. A dozen frames are late. They're past that 11.1 millisecond line, and that resulted in stuttering in the headset. So it is possible to use the latest Adrenalin drivers, but you have to make sure you have plenty of GPU headroom so that you don't trigger a dropped frame, or you don't trigger asynchronous warp or motion smoothing if you have those enabled, because the effects that has in the headset are undesirable. For those curious about the CPU frame times, here is that chart. It's basically identical. There are some data points to the right side of the 90 hertz line, but FPS VR did not recognize those as drop frames. So with all this analysis behind us, I'm going to try and draw some conclusions. With Adrenalin 24.12.1, I think I've seen an improvement in the headset latency, at least as I see it experienced inside the VR visor. I also tried my Quest 3, but unfortunately I didn't have time to record any results. Regardless, there are still some bugs, and it's super important for you guys that care about this to go to the AMD forums so we can get this pushed across the line by the dev team. They're so close to getting it figured out. With this SPS analysis, we saw the advantage of using this technology with GeForce. It will let you pair a slower CPU with the fast graphics card, as well as increase the render speed. But your GPU is going to have an upper limit on the render resolution it is capable of. When it comes to Radeon, the 7900 XTX is priced around a 4070 Ti super level. For iRacing, because of SPS, I would probably take the GeForce, but for other VR titles, it's probably close. If you're pairing the 7900 with a slower CPU, you will be disappointed with the performance. And I know I'm saying that by testing it with the currently fastest available. But we do have new graphics cards coming out soon, and rumors are swirling. AMD seems unwilling to fight NVIDIA at the high end. They're focused on the mid range, and that appears to be the target for their next graphics card. And it might be slower than a 7900 XT and an XTX. So what I was showing today might be the best Radeon performance in iRacing we'll see going into 2025. And if you believe competition keeps prices down, this is not good news for us. If all of these rumors are true, the top 4 models from NVIDIA are going to only be competing with themselves and previous GeForce models. With the 4080 Super and 4090 inventory already dried up, so NVIDIA is in a position to kind of set whatever prices it wants. To end on a positive note, AC Evo is just around the corner, so we all have that to look forward to. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe. See you next year.